Okay, let's get this show on the road. Now, when you all look at me, what do you see? No, not that. Do you see a Black woman that you think perhaps grew up in the inner city, or perhaps an unwed mother, or I'm conservative, maybe a privileged Black that's turned her back on everyone else? I mean, what do you really see? Uh, Often we look at people and we assume all sorts of things about them. And if you had any of the assumptions about me that I just outlined, you'd be wrong on all accounts. My story is an unlikely journey that has taken me places I never imagined. I've seen life from the bottom, from the middle, and now, dare I say, from the pinnacle. I'll say it. And what I have to offer today cannot be learned in a classroom or purchased on Amazon. Today, I'm offering for free life lessons and common sense observations gleaned from my life experiences, my non-traditional education, and my 28 years spent in academia. What you need to know is that the Dr. Carol Swain standing before you was never supposed to happen. I'm the one with the shiny forehead that you can't see the eyes. So I was one of 12 children, born in rural poverty in southwestern Virginia, no running water, no plumbing, which meant that we did not have a bathroom. We didn't even have an outhouse. And we often scavenged for food, hunting, fishing, whatever we could find. And I can attest to the fact that no rabbit or squirrel was safe around us. And that would not be true for possums. Even we had our standards. We didn't go to school very often. One year we missed 80, me and my siblings, we missed 80 of 180 school days, and we all failed that year. I was bullied because of my clothes or what I had in my lunch. And back in those days, if you had biscuits in your lunch rather than sliced white bread, you would be teased. And my siblings called me Frankenstein because I have a scar that starts up here and it goes down to here. And I got that when I was about 2 years old. And so you think about Frankenstein, it's kind of in the appropriate place. And they also called me fish eyes. And anyone who's fished knows when they come out of the water, the eyes are big and bulging. And so they called me fish eyes. And my mother, who might have been considered an early women's, that's the shack today. That was taken, that photograph was taken a few months ago. When we buried my mother, we stopped off, trudged through fields and valleys, and took that photograph. All that remains. But my mother might have been considered an early women's liberator because she divorced my father in the 1950s, and back then women didn't get divorced. And she and the mountain man she would later marry were both alcoholics. I was a teen wife at age 16 and a teen mother at age 17. And now social scientists would say that someone like me was underprivileged, a victim, going nowhere, and doomed to fail. And yet, they would be wrong. I didn't. Marriage was my escape. I married a neighbor who was a few years older. My self-esteem was so low, I was thrilled that anyone would have me. He had a job and a car, and we were soon building a brand new house from the ground up, thanks to the government's FHA 235 home loan program, All that was needed was $300 down, and he had his tax refund. And I was living at that time better than anyone else in my family. And to them, I was rich. And I can attest to the fact that I've always had more than other members of my family. And that has caused me a lot of guilt and a lot of grief. And it was the 1970s, time of recession. We didn't have much food or money, but we were not on welfare. I had 3 children during this time, and I can remember walking to the store, one strapped to my chest, one on my back, and one by the hand. And I can't remember how I got groceries home, but I do remember having 3 children and walking everywhere I had to go. The last born, my baby, my daughter Tracy, died of a crib death. And I struggled with depression that led to suicide gestures. And I ended up in the mental ward of a hospital. And that hospitalization changed the course of my life. My doctor, Dr. Jeff, a young white intern, spoke words that would change how I saw myself. He said, "You're intelligent, you're attractive, you can do a lot more with your life." And I was startled because no one had ever said those words to me. And I began to think of myself differently. And I remembered that there was a time when I was once smart, and that conversation was the impetus that led me to earn my high school equivalency and take jobs outside the home. I worked in a garment factory as a department store sales clerk. I sold smoke detectors from door to door, and I even worked in fast food for half a day. I was so nervous and shy. I couldn't hear or call out the orders. So when people came through the line, I simply gave them what I thought they should eat that day. And the interesting thing is that no one complained. And at the end of the shift, I fired myself and I turned in that uniform, and that was the end of my days in fast food. It was an African orderly from Sierra Leone that I worked with at a nursing home who spoke the words that set in motion my thirst for education. One day in the break room, Abu said, "You ought to go to college. I go to school with a lot of people who are not as smart as you are." Until then, I didn't know that college was a possibility. And for a minute, I want you all to pause and think about this. I would say that God used 2 different men of 2 different races, religions, and backgrounds to speak the words of life into me that would set the stage for who I am today. Take it or leave it, like it or not. They spoke into my life. I started my educational journey at Virginia Western Community College. I was a work study student in the library. The night shift workers frequently called out. That always created chaos. And since I was always willing to work, the library director created a full-time job for me, nights and weekends. And it was perfect. I could take my children to work with me. And I'll let you in on a little secret. No one uses the library nights and weekends. I earned a 2-year degree in business in 2 years. And my goal at the time was to become a mall store manager. But when I began to apply for jobs, I was told I needed a 4-year degree. So I decided to get a 4-year degree. I also decided to become an honor student. So I studied books on how to study, and I looked for the major that had the least amount of math. It also had to be interesting. I landed on criminal justice and graduated from Roanoke College, magna cum laude, while working full time. And the only thing I knew after graduation was that I did not want a career in criminal justice. Like a lot of other Blacks, I was going to work for the government. I was going to have me one of those nice government jobs with all those benefits. So I went to Virginia Tech. I got a master's degree in political science in 1 year. I was fast at everything. And while I was there, I was pressured to continue my education. I was told that there was a critical need for Black professors and Black role models. Now, I wasn't interested in any of that. I just wanted a job. And I applied for jobs for which I was qualified, and me and honest students couldn't find one. It was the 1980s, and affirmative action was in full swing, and I still couldn't find a job as an honor student, none that I wanted. And at the urging of my professors, I applied to graduate school and was admitted to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill's PhD program in political science, and I was given a generous stipend. The Duke graduate director called me up and told me that Duke was a white upper class party school and that I would be much happier at Carolina, so they would not be admitting me. And I made them refund my money, the admissions money. And later I had the satisfaction of turning them down for a tenure track position. That's not in my notes. I digress. Whatever professors or authority figures told me I needed to do for success, I did. And as a student, I gave conference papers and I became known across the country. And I was a hot commodity. Every job included a sign-in bonus. And during that era, colleges and universities offered minority positions, but I refused to apply to any of those. And I chose Princeton. And Princeton won in the competition because they recruited me the way I wanted to be recruited. I was never asked to apply for a minority position. I competed with everyone else for an American politics position. And when I was hired, and I don't know where I got this, whatever I was carrying around at that time, I told them when I was hired that I would earn early tenure. And most people don't get tenure at Princeton, but they just hired me and I came from nowhere and I said, well, I'm going to be earning early tenure. Everyone said, oh yeah, that's so nice. And I did. And I've always been driven by a desire to prove things. And I told people when I was hired that I would earn early tenure. And I wanted to prove that someone from my background could start at Princeton, earn tenure, and earn it early. And I achieved my goal. I was making more money than I imagined. And I won the career prize for a political scientist for my first book, Black Faces, Black Interests. And so it won the Woodrow Wilson Foundation Award for best book published in the United States in several fields. It competed among 600 and some books. And it's usually the career prize. The name has been changed from Woodrow Wilson because we cannot have prizes in Woodrow Wilson's name anymore. And I won, the D.B. Hardeman Award, Best Book on Congress, published in a 2-year period, a co-winner of V.O. Key Award, Library Choice. And so I hit a home run out of the gate, and I was miserable. Success did not bring happiness. I experienced rejection from white liberals and prominent Black scholars who accused me, a lifelong Democrat, of being a sellout because I didn't share their view on issues like affirmative action, poverty, and race relations. And I didn't fit their expectations of how a Black person should think or act. And I was quietly told, almost in a whisper, you don't need to share the story of where you came from. People don't need to know that. My story was an embarrassment to them. My success was undermining their narrative, and I was not living their truth, and I was being punished for my success. It hurt. And I began to question everything I believed. I began to doubt myself, and the emptiness and the misery sent me on a search for answers. And I've always been a seeker of truth. And I've always known that there was something much larger than me guiding my life. And I had to find it. And my journey took me many places. And the turning point was when I ended up in the Princeton hospital for a physical condition that led to a spiritual experience while I was there and culminated in a Christian conversion. And so my search for truth had come to an end, and I was delivered from a lifelong crippling shyness. And I was in my 40s then. And unfortunately, for people that don't like me, I've been talking ever since. And my conversion caused me to re-examine the world through fresh eyes. And I realized that I had been indoctrinated, lied to, deceived, and I had kicked and ignored. And as a political scientist, I now found myself becoming more interested in what the political parties actually stood for. I looked closely at their party platforms. I saw contradictions between what I believed and what the parties preached. And frankly, I was troubled. I'd grown up believing that one particular side was the party for the working man. It was the party of civil rights. And I firmly believed that the other party had abandoned civil rights, embraced white supremacists, and had become defenders of the rich. Everyone knew that, right? Wrong. One side was telling me that I was a victim and I needed the government to take care of me. And they had all the answers for people like me. It was free health care, free housing, free education, free daycare, free transportation, free, everything for free. In other words, socialism was what was being introduced and being sold. And that just didn't set right with me. I left that party, the Democrats, and I became an independent. And as time passed, I began to examine closely what the Republicans stood for. And I soon discovered that the Republican Party was closest to my beliefs about liberty, equality, individualism, free enterprise, free speech, and adherence to the Constitution. And what appealed to me as a new Christian believer was their emphasis on God, country, and family, as did their emphasis on limited government. So in 2009, I became a Republican, not because they were perfect. I'm not that stupid, but because their ideals aligned more closely with what I believed as a Christian. And to me today, I'm not happy with either party. I waver between Republicans and independents. And at the end of the day, I'm just not thrilled with politics as a solution to the world's problems. And when I look back, I attribute much of my success to having grown up at a time of great optimism about the future. I watched as three major civil rights acts passed during my childhood. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Open Housing Act of 1968. And we became equal under the law. Now, of course, people have always had individual prejudices, but under the law, we became equal. And despite my impoverished background, I was not raised to believe I was a victim. The messages I received from my family and others was, if you worked hard and you got an education, you could make something out of yourself. And there's something else. I grew up at a time of patriotism. I grew up loving America and believing that the American dream was possible. The emphasis at the time was on what you could do for yourself. And so I believed that I could achieve the American dream, and I did. And most of my mentors did not share my race or my sex. My mentors saw potential in me I never knew I had. And they encouraged me to reach for the stars. And I can tell you that there were many times when I wanted to stop, get a regular job, have a normal life. And at some point, I was very resentful because I felt like I was doing it for them and not for me, because they'd said, I expect great things from you. And so I'm doing the work, but feeling like I'm doing it for them and not for me. So that propelled me forward. I kept going. So what have I learned? I've learned a lot. I've learned many lessons from the sum total of my life experiences. And what I've discovered is that many of the things that we have been taught or told to believe are false. They're lies. And what largely determines our what largely determines our success or how far we go is determined by what we believe about the world. Positive change cannot happen if we believe the world is stacked against us and that the ability to change our lives or our world is beyond our control. We each have our own story, our own journey, our own path, and our own destiny. Opportunities abound. We can take advantage of them, waste them, or allow others to keep us from seeing them. Our attitudes and what we believe about the world and the possibilities in it will either free us or hold us in bondage. It's our choice. I chose truth. Truth that led me to freedom. And the truth is out there. You can find truth, you can know truth, and it is truth that will set you free. And this message, I dare say, applies to everyone in this room. So now we shift to the shifting academic environment. I spent about half of my life in and around college and university campuses, from being an adult undergraduate student, going to graduate school, being an assistant professor, going through all those ranks, and a shift. I saw a shift taking place, and academia changed along with me. And I found that academia was no longer a marketplace for ideas. At least when I was in graduate school and when I was an undergraduate, it seemed to be a marketplace for ideas. There were conservative professors, liberal professors, people in between, but you got challenged with different ideas. And you were exposed to things that you had never heard before, and that made education exciting. But academia had changed. It was gradually becoming openly hostile to free speech and conservative values. And critical race theory, the belief that white people are responsible for the world's problems, was metastasizing like a cancer and infecting every department of the university. Demands for safe spaces, trigger warnings, personal pronouns, separate graduations, and separate course sections were becoming prevalent, as were demands for speech codes and political correctness. And everyone was on the search for microaggressions, perceived insults, or threats to complain about, with the emphasis being on perceived as opposed to actual. And where did all this come from? This slide once had a title, Dead Philosophers Have Consequences, but I thought maybe I should change it to Neo-Marxist Ideas Have Consequences. What do y'all think? Neo-Marxist philosophical ideas and academic theories were impacting college and university campuses in ways that made the critical dialogue and debate almost impossible. Universities were shifting away from their core missions to educate young people, and they were not systematically exposing them to the divergent ideas necessary for the development of critical thinking skills. You cannot develop critical thinking skills unless you're exposed to opposing ideas, and you have to wrestle with those ideas. And today, we're just reaping the fruits of seeds that were sown a long time ago, and we're seeing the harvest. So what happened to me? In 2017, I took early retirement from Vanderbilt University. I stepped out of an academic classroom and into a platform that has enabled me to reach millions of people through film, social media, books, television, and radio. And then I also started a 501c3 nonprofit named Be the People Project to help change the direction of to help change the direction of America's culture by educating people about conservative values and principles and helping them understand the importance of the contributions of America's Judeo-Christian heritage. And here I stand before you. I now believe it's time for me to return to the classroom and use my education, experience, and training to help train the current generation of truth seekers. And there's something tugging at my heart, and it's my desire to sow into the lives of young people. And I'm here because I would really love an opportunity to help train the current generation, that next generation of leaders, that should be in Congress, should be in places of power, but for the right reasons, not to benefit themselves personally. I do believe that there is a place for voices that are conservative, and there's a place for our traditional values and principles, and that young people need to be encouraged. Those that want more for themselves and they're not being fulfilled or satisfied with what they're encountering. So, and looking back over my career in academia, I can see how my life experiences have shaped my worldview and the research questions that I have pursued as a graduate student. And with my first book, Black Faces, Black Interests, when I asked a very simple question, in fact, I can tell you all that common sense will take you a long way. My simple question that led to the prize-winning book was, is it really true that only Blacks can represent Blacks? That was a research question. And Black Faces, Black Interests has been reprinted in 2006, was the beginning of the journey that culminated with that prize-winning book that launched my career, and it got me labeled as conservative long before I knew I was conservative. And some of the things the book identified, a trade-off between descriptive and substantive research. I argued that you can have more Black faces and less Black representation. I argued that whites could represent Blacks and Blacks could represent whites, and men could represent women, and women could represent men, and your best representative might be someone that didn't look like you. And I warned of the unintended consequences of race-based districting when it came to redistricting. And the book was published in 1993. And I talked about what would happen if the Republicans took over the Congress, what would happen to Black power. And I don't think people could imagine it, but then the next year it happened, and everything that I said would happen if Republicans took over. They took over for the first time in 40 years, a year after this book was published. And so it certainly got people's attention. My next major book, and I did not give that book the title. In fact, I did not like the title of that book, but Cambridge University Press assured me that they had, I don't know how many years, let's just say they said, we have 135 or 150 years of accumulated experience. We know how to title books. And so they came up with that title and that cover. And what I found was that there were a lot of white people that were ashamed to be seen carrying that book around because of the cover and because of the title. They were afraid that people would think it meant that they were white nationalists. And that book was nominated by the publisher for a Pulitzer Prize. And as part of my data, I had a white research assistant at Princeton, because I started it while I was at Princeton. This man was Italian, in his 50s. We identified 10 leading leaders of white rights, white nationalist groups. Some of them were extremists, like William Pierce, who wrote the Turner Diaries. Others were gentlemen like Jared Taylor, very Yale graduate, London School of Economics, that would make a case for white people being racialists without racial epithets, but by using social science data, FBI statistics. And he would argue that diversity was not our strength. But those interviews were conducted, and the book was really a warning about the direction of race relations at the time. And that book, which was published after I left Princeton got me labeled as apocalyptic, sensationalist, and probably a few other things. But one of the criticisms was that those people that were interviewed did not deserve to be interviewed. My philosophy has always been what you don't know can hurt you. I would much rather know what people are thinking, what they're planning, how they reason. The person that keeps their mouth quiet and they're planning and plotting, there are people that with the stroke of a pen, that they're in positions of power, they can be very quietly harming you in ways you never imagined. And so the book argued one of the things was that multiculturalism and identity politics was providing the language for white people to organize along racial lines. And you know, like I noticed that there were racial double standards that young people at Princeton and Vanderbilt, young white people, were recognizing. And they were upset about some of the grievances, and they didn't mind kids from the inner city going to their elite private schools, but they were upset when Black kids that came from backgrounds that they considered similar to their own, that were not, you know, serious students, got into Princeton too, or got into the Ivy League too, and they knew that they were not strong students. And so I saw anger among students regarding that. And the book points out that the racial double standards are and were problematic, that if we argue that there are Black interests, there are brown interests, you know, that all these other groups have interests, but white people don't, and that every group should celebrate where they came from and their heritage, but white people can't, that we were opening the door to something that was very dangerous. And so I was very much warning about the slippery slope. And I felt that the identity politics and the multiculturalism, how we were doing it, it was providing, you know, the language for everyone to organize by group. And in a nation as diverse as America, it just doesn't work. And so that book was published in 2002. Fast forward, look at where we are today. Okay, this book here, Be the People, a call to reclaim America's faith and promise. And I have the words Be the People trademarked. And so that's why I had the Be the People Foundation, the Be the People, everything. Be the People is a call to the we the people in the preamble of the Constitution to stand up and take responsibility for the condition of the nation. And I published this book in 2011. The intended audience was the 78% of people at the time who profess to be Christians. And I'm looking out on the landscape and thinking that either these people don't understand Christianity or they don't understand what's happening in our country, but that they needed a book that would introduce them to some of the issues that were taking place in our country and also the biblical position. And so in each of the chapters, I provided information and I talked about how we were becoming Orwellian. I warned about the alliance at the time between NSA and Google. At that time, President Obama was pursuing an alliance with Google, knew that was bad. And at the time also, the president was seeking permission to assassinate American citizens suspected of terrorism. He was granted that right. And, you know, just think about it. That was the beginning of the erosion of the rule of law, that you could assassinate American citizens suspected of terrorism. They were not people that it had been proven. And so we were headed in the wrong direction. And so I published that book, and it was written for the general public. And it was a turning point for me, and all of my subsequent books have really been addressed to, you know, I would say real people, people that I think would be more active if they knew more about what was taking place in our nation. And I also published this book, 2011, thinking that it was going to change the world and it was going to change the outcome of the 2012 election, and it didn't. Okay, these are my most recent books. Black Eye for America was a best-selling book. It came out at the right time when there were parents, there were teachers, there were so many people trying to understand what was happening with critical race theory. And then this book, Countercultural Living, that was a book that was commissioned by a church, and it was part of a 12-book series. I'm the only non-theologian that contributed to that series. And then my most recent book, The Adversity of Diversity. And with Black Eye for America, I argue that critical race theory is a racist ideology, that it's rooted in neo-Marxism, that it violates the US Constitution, our civil rights laws, traditional American values, and the tenets of Christianity, and that it needs to be resisted in education at every level. Now, there's nothing wrong with, graduate students, college students studying theories, but when it's in K through 12 education, when it's been distilled to that level, there's something really wrong with it when a theory is being taught as a fact. And so Black Eye for America concluded with 2 chapters on how parents could fight back and the things that we thought they needed. It had a glossary, appendices, and the model school board language. And it was written with a PhD from Georgetown, Dr. Christopher Shore, who had a military background, and he quantified work from my first book for his dissertation, not my first book, The New White Nationalism. A lot of that book was qualitative research. And so Chris had the quantitative skills to quantify and demonstrate what I was saying quantitatively. And with political science, you get no respect unless you can prove it with statistics. And so Chris did that for me. And he was not able to get a job because he was conservative. He was Christian, military, and he made the unfortunate decision to write about my book on white nationalism. And so he started as a research assistant, and I made him my co-author, and he is happily working for a think tank in Maryland, and he is conservative. He's the only conservative there, but his skills are so strong that he has a position. But Chris should be on a university campus. That's what he trained for. That was his heart. But because of the politics of the day, a young Christopher Shore could not get a position as a faculty member so far. And I think that's unfortunate. Okay, so we fast forward to this book. And this book was published in August. And work was started on it back when the Supreme Court decided that they were going to take up the students for fair admissions involving Harvard and University of North Carolina. And I anticipated that they would have to strike down race-based affirmative action. And I felt that the discrimination against whites and Asians had gone so far away from the Civil Rights Act, so far away from the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution, that the Supreme Court had to act. And so the book, my goal was to get it out within 2 weeks of the decision. And so, the book has not done well. And it, I know, it encountered every opposition. Amazon, the world's largest bookseller, would not put it up for like maybe 10 days. And for a book to have an impact, it needs to be out there where you can get it. Then they would not allow reviews. It couldn't be reviewed. So what does that mean? It means that I have to appeal. So I appealed. And so then they allowed the book to have reviews. And then they told people it would be 3 months before they could get a copy. And I assumed that there was some DEI person working at Amazon or wherever they work, and that maybe each time I appealed, then it went to someone higher. And eventually, the book is out there. And when I say that it hasn't done well, it hasn't done well by my standards. But it's sold, maybe 3,000 to 5,000 copies. But that's not what I expect my books to do. I expect my books to do better. But this book is a book that talks about a lot about the corporate world and how DEI has been used in the corporate world, and just how it has led to decisions that's hurt companies as well as stockholders. And there are chapters, that talks about, even in the educational realm, Roland Fryer, an economist at Harvard, one of the things that he pointed out was that the universities take the pool, they're all fighting for the same handful of students, and that what they ought to be doing is identifying K through 12 schools, feeder schools, pouring into those schools and trying to enlarge the pool. But instead, what we have is a situation where many institutions, colleges, and universities have vowed not to comply with the US Supreme Court decision. And it reminds me of the Brown v. Board of Education school desegregation case that happened in 1954, the year I was born. We did not get integrated schools in Virginia until 1968 in my part of Virginia, Bedford County. And it was because the state engaged in massive resistance. And so fast forward today, we have all of these university professors changing the names of their DEI programs to something else, and they have vowed that they're going to resist the Supreme Court decision. And I think that we shouldn't allow them to get away with it, because what they're doing is not benefiting minority students. It's not benefiting anyone, and it's violating our laws that I think are very important. So here we are, getting close to the conclusion of my talk. For those of you all that are antsy, the summation of what I've learned is that identity politics does not bring us closer to truth, that it is a false trap that divides us along racial, gender, class, and religious lines, and that identity politics can never bring about unity or equality for racial or political minorities, because it's rooted in neo-Marxism. And neo-Marxism is rooted in conflict theory. A conflict model can never bring about reconciliation or any kind of healing. And I believe our goal as a nation and as a community should be e pluribus unum, out of many one. And regardless of where we come from, we are individual human beings who carry a spark of divinity. And if we've learned anything from Marxism and the decline of great universities, it's that armchair philosophers, people sitting in their offices, twirling ideas, cannot solve world problems. They can make world problems, but they can't solve world problems with their theories. My apologies to the philosophers in the room. And I think it's time for us to tap into the wisdom of our ancestors and to return to first principles, common sense, science, and the unfettered pursuit of knowledge. Knowledge is the promise of the future. And so with that, she was done. Thank you. I will gladly take your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Swain. We do have both an in-person audience and a virtual audience. And for the virtual audience, I'll remind you that you can scroll down to get to the Q&A button and ask questions that way. I'll go back and forth between the live audience and questions from the virtual audience. I'm going to start with my own question.
Okay.
So, your subtitle of your latest book is that the recent Supreme Court decision students for admissions will doom diversity programs.
And it has, and they are getting rid of many of them, or they're changing the names of them and trying to pretend that they're not violating the civil rights laws.
That's where my question comes. That is, given the way that that universities have been captured, I would say, ideologically, by people who support affirmative action regardless of the law. Do you think that they really will decision will doom diversity programs, or do you think that they will continue to live on, with other names and by proxies, even though the decision made clear that proxies for race were illegal as well?
Well, first of all, and I probably shouldn't say this, I would like to send the faculties of America to re-education camps, because affirmative action and the things that they're doing, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. And we were doing some things that worked. And you look at my story, and I have a chapter on my own affirmative action journey, in the sense that with my being born in 1954, I came through at a period of great optimism. And I would argue that what benefited people like me, and like there have been many Blacks that are much older, like Bob Woodson, who's 84 years old, the founder of the Woodson Center. There have been many successful Blacks, and these people were successful before the passage of the Civil Rights Act. Civil rights movement was not about lowering standards. It was not about preferential treatment. It was about non-discrimination. And that's what the Civil Rights Act was about. And what I benefited from was, after the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, it benefited everyone, whites as well as Blacks, because for the first time, jobs had to be advertised nationally. So it meant that the old boys network, the old girls network, where you picked up the phone, you called someone you knew for your referrals, all the jobs had to be advertised. So people learned about opportunities. It opened doors. And then, colleges and universities, many jobs, they sent out recruiters. They sent people to neighborhoods to make individuals aware of opportunities. And they were seeking talented minorities. And so I would say that, we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is not the same as the diversity that we initially sought. And I would argue that there's nothing wrong with diversity. As a Christian, look at the universe. Everything's diverse. Diversity is positive, but the meaning of diversity has changed in a way that it's not about individuals, being integrated into a situation. They become a part of the whole. Everyone works together. It's about bringing in groups, and they maintain their separate identities. And it's about ensuring equal outcomes. During my era, when I got to that community college and went on to Roanoke College and other places, I had an equal opportunity to succeed or to fail. And it was up to me and my efforts. And I saw many people along the way that got their foot in the door that failed. And some of those people failed because maybe they started at an institution where it was not right for them. But think about me. I had a high school equivalency. I started at a community college. They took everyone. You didn't even have to have a high school equivalency to start there. I had one. And so I was able to prove myself to go, to different tiers of institutions. And I think when you take someone that should have started at a community college, send them to the flagship state university, a lot of those people are going to flunk out, and they're going to be angry. And I believe that's why we have so many protests on campuses, that people are angry, and they have a right to be angry because they're being used. Institutions use them to count the numbers. They want to look good. And that's one reason I would argue that you have so many DEI officers. University of Michigan, I saw a study, I believe they have 163 DEI personnel. I'm sure they're all minorities. They count them. Michigan looks good. University of Virginia, I believe they have 83. Virginia Tech, they have 60 some. These are public institutions. And that's one reason why students are paying higher tuition, is that they have this bureaucratic infrastructure. They have so many people in these departments that in some cases, more people in the DEI division than they have in the academic fields. So that's a long, I answer questions like a girl.
So First off, I just want to point out that the entrapping of terrorists thing happened after 9/11 under Bush. Okay, so that was a Republic affair. I think you were saying that was maybe from
Did I say anything about that?
Yeah, about how you could just arrest people on suspicion of terrorism.
Did I? Was that part of my? What?
But anyway, I was just a question. I'm a philosopher.
Well, go back to your question.
Oh, no, that was just a point of fact, not a question.
I'm not talking about arrest. I'm saying assassinate people suspected of terrorism. There were New York Times articles of the president making a decision with his list of who was going to live and who was going to die.
Oh.
That happened under Obama.
Okay, gotcha.
And we can look that up. And I know for some of you all, the New York Times is the gospel. We can go to the New York Times and I can show you.
All right, thank you for that clarification.
Okay.
So I'm a philosopher, but I'm more interested in kind of moral psychology these days.
Okay.
In business school. And so I'm interested in kind of how you were able to, because many Marxists might reply, given the fact that you couldn't even get a job, right? I guess this was Virginia after your master's degree.
I didn't get a job that I wanted.
Right. Well, whatever. Good job.
I wanted to work in the marketing department of Norfolk and Southern Railroad. They were the best employer in Virginia. And so there were jobs that I wanted that I did not get, but I'm a Christian and I believe that God had a different plan for my life. And if I were given the long version of my story, when I was working in that nursing home, I applied to be a nurse. Never got, I didn't get into nursing school. Had I gotten into nursing school, that would not be the same Carol Swain story. So I believe that there's a plan for every life and that those doors that closed made it possible for me to go far beyond anything I imagined because no one in my family knew anything about being a university professor.
So I was not quite finished the question. So DI, right? Now you know there's a new letter that's being added to it, right?
Yeah, B for belonging. How can you make people?
My question for you is that when you went to these schools, you probably didn't feel a sense of belonging, right? Because you was always white people, probably. And I was wondering, do you feel like this is a right that people have to feel a sense of belonging? Or is this something that they just need to kind of buck up and deal with?
Well, I can tell. Well, let me tell you that not any awkwardness I felt came from the fact that I came from such poverty. And so I'm at Princeton, young faculty member, trying to learn how to teach, but also trying to figure out which fork to pick up and which water glass is mine and all of these things. And so I think that I would have benefited from a class, the etiquette class, somebody set me down and teach me about how you function in those environments. And I think that that's more like social class. And I can tell you that having been a professor at Princeton, every now and then I would encounter working class white students that got into Princeton. And I remember one of the saddest things that I remember that I was with some seniors and some of them were white, some of them were black. They did not want their parents to come to graduation because they felt like the other Princeton parents would make their parents feel awkward. And one of the young white women from Queens wore makeup. And she said that the Princeton students would stop her all the time and say, "Are you from Rutgers?" Because Princeton girls didn't wear makeup. And so I would say that my social class and the fact that I came from poverty contributed to awkwardness. And I can also say that the people around me loved Princeton. They were in love with the institution. They had spent all their lives working to get there. And as life would have it, I breezed in and I didn't love the institution. And so that is just a fact. I was not in love with Princeton the way they were. And that's why I could leave. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Really interesting. My question is, it seems like right now on the right, there is a debate between a version of the right that wants to address some of the problems that you've raised through their own version of a combat theory, right? So we're going to lay siege to the institutions. We're going to, restrict people's views. We're going to get rid of pro-Palestinian student groups. And then there's, on the other side, more of the, the heterodox academy model. We're gonna defeat bad ideas with better ideas, and we're gonna convince some disruptors and kind of do it over time by emphasizing the liberal tradition. What's your take on that debate? Do you
Well, you know something?
More sympathetic.
I think we should live and let live. I liked it when universities appear to be marketplaces of ideas. And as an undergraduate, I mean, I'm just an oddball. When I went to Roanoke College, the Black students tried to be very helpful. They met me with a list of all the racist professors, told me whose classes not to take. And those are the ones I signed up for first. And what I found out that they were the more difficult professors. They were the ones that when I impressed them after that first semester, everyone knew my name. And when I look at my race has benefited me far more than it has hurt me. Because if I were a white or Asian honor student, I would just be another white or Asian honor student. Who cares? But because I was Black, and we can say because there were low expectations, because I was Black, everyone remembered my name. And so some people say, well, you benefited from affirmative action and you're trying to pull up the ladder and all of these things. I think I really benefited from outreach, equal opportunity, the fact that I had mentors that told me to give conference papers and they told me what I needed to do to be successful. And I followed their advice. And I believe that a lot of the conservatives that you're talking about, I think we are all concerned. And I would say not just conservatives, but parents are concerned about what's happening at the K through 12 educational level, that we draw the line on indoctrination of children. And so the idea is that when I was at Princeton, when I was in graduate school, all these ideas were around, and it was okay to be around on a college campus. But when it started infecting every department, when it's in medical schools now, and people are saying they have DEI, and 2 people are having a heart attack, one's white, one's Black, they present themselves at the emergency room, they're not going to take the person that seems to be most severe. If it's a white person, they're going to attend to the minority first because the minority may have been discriminated against in the past. I mean, all of this stuff violates the Constitution, violates the law. And going back to your question, I'm encouraging white people to learn how to document discrimination. You need to know your rights. Asians need to know their rights. Everyone needs to know their rights. They need to document when you're being discriminated against, because you have equal protection clause protections, you have civil rights protections. And I think racial and ethnic minorities like me, who have compassion and we care about all people, that we are at a point where some people feel like they can't speak up for themselves, and that we speak up. I speak up because I don't want anyone's child bullied and shamed. And you asked me, Mr. Philosopher, about belonging. I know that there's been a B added to DEI, the B for belonging. And I think that when you're young, it's an awkward time. I don't think any of us really feel comfortable in our skin, and and do we really feel like we belong? And I've always taught at elite institutions, and I've had students I've mentored, very wealthy backgrounds, but they have been impoverished in other ways. Maybe their parents didn't love them, shipped them off. They never got infection. They never got affection. And so it's like we're all walking around as wounded people. Most of us don't feel like we belong where we are. And so you can never control someone's emotions to make them feel like they belong. And so that B needs to just go away. Yes.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this.
Mhm.
I just have sort of a terms question. I'm not a philosopher, it's worse, I'm a lawyer. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you mean by identity politics. It's famously one of those words with
By identity politics. Well, when people are encouraged to rather than be individuals or be who they are, that they're encouraged to align themselves with a group. And during the time I was a professor at Princeton and Vanderbilt, and especially at Vanderbilt, I had minority students that would often come to me that they grew up having friendships with white people, different races, whether it was Black or Hispanic. They told me that when they got to the campus that they had to choose, that if they hung out with their white, they had to choose between joining the Black group or the Hispanic group or whatever group it was, joining that group or hanging out with their white friends. And for some of them, especially the kids from New York, this was like a new thing for them. And so I think that when we start identifying by our race and our ethnicity and not just as individual human beings, that's problematic, especially in a country like America, and that we are better off if we have, in my book, Be the People, I talked about there are some things that if you're Americans, you need to know. Everyone needs to read the Constitution. Everyone needs to know the Bill of Rights. Everyone needs to read the Declaration of Independence. And I would argue everyone needs to read the 10 Commandments and to know biblical knowledge, because there's so many references to biblical things in language, in law. There are references that you can't really be an educated person unless you understand the Bible. You can read it as a great book, but once we all have a framework that's based on just some founding documents, founding principles, I think we have a better basis for getting along. And for myself, I've just always been, I would say, a strong individualist. And when I was in undergrad, I didn't join the Black Student Union. I had children, I was busy. I joined the honor societies. I was very focused on getting, excelling, getting my degree, getting a job because I needed money. And so I was a single-minded seeker of what I needed to put on that resume to get a good job.
That question leads to another one from the virtual audience. Someone asks whether we should, in your view, whether we should throw away all identities and be colorblind, or is there some line that we should draw between aspects in which identity or identity politics is all right, and when it becomes pathological and detrimental?
Well, it's my understanding that with the Supreme Court decision, that what they were encouraging admissions committees to do is look at people as individuals. And so, look at where they came from, the things that they've done, but not start with a plan that you're going to have a 16% Black class, 10% Hispanic, 8% Asian, and maybe fill in the rest with whites or some other configuration. And so they were controlling things. They were discriminating against Asian students because if they used merit, the Asians would dominate. The Asians would dominate the whites. And they were discriminating against Asians the way that colleges and universities once discriminated against Jews. And there's so much wrong with identity politics. Look what's happening on college campuses. I mean, we should all be ashamed of the anti-Semitism that's taking place and just the things that our colleges and universities are allowing to take place. And I believe that, and I'm going to blame, the Marxists, neo-Marxists. There may be other groups to blame, but just for shorthand, I'm going to blame the Marxists. I think that they have weaponized racial and ethnic minorities, and that they are not friends of Black people. I don't think they're friends of trans people. I don't think they're friends of any of those groups they purport to represent. I think they're using them to advance an agenda that will be harmful to all of us in the future. And I think the ideal is integration. There was nothing wrong with integration. And when affirmative action was, first encouraged and supported, it was about bringing people into the system. They become part of the system. They work together on teams. It was not about having the situation where you bring in racial and ethnic minorities and you put them in separate course sections. If they want separate course sections, you give them separate dorms. If they want separate dorms, you encourage segregation within and on the college campus. That's not integration. And I kind of think that we had the right idea in the beginning when we focused on non-discrimination. And for me, early on, I supported means-tested affirmative action that would be open to everyone, that was, it wouldn't discriminate against whites, working class whites, poor whites from Appalachia, people that, came from, that had excelled but came from disadvantaged backgrounds. And I can tell you that as a faculty member who sat on some admissions committees at elite places, I have seen discrimination by the committee where they chose a racial and ethnic minority, a Black student that had lower scores and was not as strong as a Black student that came from a working class background who had excelled maybe the mother's a cook, the father's a janitor. And the reasoning was that this other person would fit in better. That may be a lawyer's child, a judge's child, but they would choose based on pedigree. And, you think about myself, how did I get to be at Princeton? I don't think that I was supposed to be there. Like, no, I wasn't supposed to be there. It's almost like I became a devout believer in my 40s, but it's like I got to go in. I was like everyone else. I got to see what happens, behind the closed doors, all of these things, and the programs don't work the way we think they work. And there were all these summer programs. The summer programs were supposed to bring in high school students, help prepare them for college. They would bring in students from more elite backgrounds, and they would have one or two token disadvantaged students. But the predominant majority of those summer programs were people from the better off families. And the argument was that they will fit in better. Yes.
Can you, I go back to that in the early 2000s, No Child Left Behind.
Right.
And to me, that brought education down instead of bringing everyone up. Can you address that?
I think that having accountability standards for teachers, that was a good idea. And I think that there are so many teachers that are being protected by teachers unions, and they're not good teachers. They don't believe children can learn. They're not challenging children. And there has been a move because of my work with the critical race theorists. I have met many, and I know personally some prize-winning teachers. I mean, they won all the prizes. And those teachers are being told that they have to teach by a script, and they're having observers come into the classroom and watch them. And so all the things that they learned to teach math, and they were able to bring out, the latent talents in students that were disadvantaged, those teachers are at a disadvantage because they have dumbed it down where all the teacher has to do is read a script. They tell them what they can bring into the classroom, and we don't see better results. Look at education. Look where we rank compared to other nations. Everything that is being done, that has been done, has not benefited racial and ethnic minorities. And what do they tell us? They tell us things like math is racist. Math is racist. I can tell you that math is challenging. When I was at that community college, I took remedial math. I had to take that remedial math to be able to take statistics, to be able to, to get my PhD. It was challenging, but it was not racist.
Your book, Be the People, was published in 2011, and it was a very particular moment. And I think you mentioned that you were hoping that that book would shape people's ideas and help them to think in a different way, given the particular moment we were in as a nation. How would you revise that book for this particular moment? What would you add, if anything, to that book?
Well, I'm sure that's a good question, but I kind of don't go back and revise.
Okay.
So I would not revise that book.
Oh, how about if you had to write a new book?
But I'm going to tell you this, the New White Nationalism, I made such a mistake with that book. That book is 550 pages. It has probably 5 chapters on affirmative action. And that was because that kept coming up. And I felt that was dividing people. And if I had to do it over again, I would have had 2 books. And a person, more senior, who could have been a mentor, told me at the time that I had 2 books instead of 1 book, and that I should take the extra time to make 2 books. But I went ahead and kept the 550-page book. And as a consequence, I think it probably didn't have the impact it would have had. But I blame Cambridge University Press and that cover, because I think it turned off a lot of people, and it was a book you want to have in a brown paper bag. Yes. I can't remember now, but it definitely wasn't the New White Nationalism in America. But I did see a New White Nationalism. And what I noticed that had shifted was that instead of, at that time, I would estimate that there were probably 2,000 or 3,000 Klansmen in the whole country. And every now and then they'd have a rally, and they would be on TV, and they would show you the guys with the beer guts and the missing teeth, and they would look like a bunch of fools. And what I saw was really educated people that were making intellectual arguments that that I could see, knowing my personality and stuff like that. I could imagine myself being that poor white kid from Appalachia and hearing those arguments. And we've had a great bit of ethnic fraud. Ask Elizabeth Warren, and ask some of these, not just her. Look at all these people that we're finding out that they were not Native Americans, they were not whatever they said they were. But when you check the box and you are applying for college, there's no one following you home with a DNA test. And so people that want to game the system, they have gamed the system all along. And when I was at Princeton, there were some students that people suspected were not minorities, but you couldn't prove it. And so ethnic fraud has always been a problem. The system has invited it. And it's because there are people that have felt that it was an unjust system. And so those that wanted to get ahead would do whatever they needed to do to advance themselves. And if checking the box was how you did it, that's what they did.
You mentioned being excited about getting back into the classroom. What kind of courses would you want to teach for us?
Well, what I would like to do is talk with the chair of political science and maybe the undergraduate director and see what they're interested in. And I've met with some students, they've made suggestions, but ideally, I think I would want to be affiliated or have my courses cross-listed with political science, and I would say ethnic studies, even though I'm not a big fan of anything that ends with studies. I think that I would want to do that because I would want a diverse group of students. And I believe if I offered courses on issues that relate to race or slavery or some of the issues of the day that are being debated, that I might have more quote diversity in the classroom. And so I have taught courses on the civil rights movement and courses on hate groups and various things. So I would rather talk with people and then propose courses because they're all going to be new preps. I haven't taught since 2016.
You get some pushback if you taught ethnic studies.
No, I don't want to teach that. I want to cross-list my courses. And, I assume that I would submit a course proposal and they would either sign off on it or they wouldn't. But if I would like for their students to know that there were courses available on topics that they might be interested in. And, being on campus, there's something about campuses that I love, especially the fall, when the freshmen come in and they're so sweet and so innocent and so young. And to watch them grow up, that was one of the things I loved as a faculty member, but it's just something about the energy of the campus and being around young people that really appeals to me. And I speak all over the country. I've spoken at Texas A&M, WNL, University of Wisconsin, at Madison, Northwestern, all of these places, like in the last year. And I want more sustained relationships, the kind that develop over the course of a semester.
Well, let me ask another question from the virtual audience. This is about political polarization in the United States. The question suggests that we're not a United States now, but a divided states, a group of divided states. So in your opinion, how did we get here? And how did it start, and how do we get away from that?
I think part of the polarization has to do with we started jettison freedom of speech. And Cass Sunstein, a professor, I guess he's still at the University of Chicago, he wrote a book some years ago that said that if you have people, like-minded people in the same room and they're just talking to one another, they become more extreme. But if you bring in the other side and you have people talking back and forth, you get less polarization. And I think part of what I saw happening on university campuses during the transition, they went from a situation where you would have a panel on a topic like immigration or poverty or any kind of issue, and there would always be one token conservative. You'd always have at least one. And whenever I taught something, I would always try to have the different sides. But we got to the point where people, really only wanted to talk among themselves. And then when you have these demands for safe spaces, because you might say something that someone might feel uncomfortable, and you shut down free speech, I think the result is polarization. And that we wanted to get rid of polarization, we would have to acknowledge that there's no one side that has it completely right. And that if you get in a room and with people that are smart and they have different ideas and they talk back and forth, I think everyone's going to leave the room the better, and that you're going to come out at a position that's going to be better than the position that you started with. And so that my ideal, and what I think would be the ideal for the country, is that we restore free speech and some of those values that we have talked about, we once believed in, but we seem to have jettisoned in recent years.
That was my question from before. I also am teaching at college level, and I have debates that we had in high school. I'm the same generation as you, and you had to prepare both sides.
Right.
And I really see the value of that, and I've had that for my students. Give them a topic that's very controversial.
Right.
They have to prepare both sides, and then I get to draw from the hat. And I found that inspired them to learn both sides and also to see both sides. And I like that. If you can do that in a classroom, it makes us be more objective.
Well, I can tell you that over the years, I noticed that the students changed, and how they changed was like when I first started my career, you had these eager young people coming in, and they wanted to learn from the professor. But then later, they started coming in and they wanted to lecture the professor because they had already been indoctrinated in, at their elite private schools or wherever they were. And what they did was they had solved all the great problems of the world. They knew all the answers because they had been indoctrinated. They had memorized the answers, and some of them were rewarded for that. And with the conservative students, they had different strategies for survival. And some of them, would laugh about the papers that they wrote for the liberal professors, stuff that they didn't believe, but they did it, they were just gaming it, but they knew why they were doing it. And then what I've always told conservative students is that you have to be better. You have to know their arguments, you have to know your arguments, and you have to be better than other people. And I've also told students is that you don't have to fight every battle. Everyone doesn't have to know what you're thinking, but there's some of us that are wired in such a way that we're so transparent that everyone does know what we're thinking. And so like, we don't have a choice. And if they ever start chopping off heads, they start with us. But for the rest of you all, if you're shy or if your personality is on the quiet side, there is a need for people like you. And I think it's important for there to be true diversity of thought on college and university campuses in the classroom. And we've reached a point where there are a lot of young people that don't even consider academia, or they don't consider certain fields because they say, well, I would never get through. And I don't think that's the right attitude. And I can also tell you that my experiences have been that some of my strongest supporters have been people who were, I would say, classical liberals. Many of them were secular Jews, and they believed in free speech. They believed in the Constitution. And if you had ideas and you were a creative person, I mean, they would fight for you. They would serve in your committees. And I think that in academia, that there are more people who actually would want things to be more open than they are, but they have fear. And you could pay a price for standing for things, that we used to accept. And until there's more courage among faculty, I think that we're going to have an environment where people are going to feel afraid. And the nice thing about being my age, you know, like this is what you see is what you get. And you know, you're free. But I can also say that when I was at Princeton, various places, I've always been who I am, and I've always been not afraid to deal with issues that other people shied away from. And a lot of my work, people say it was ahead of its time, and I kind of see that as a gift. But I credit common sense with all my great breakthroughs.
I think this idea of sort of free speech on campus and sort of university and sort of university professors needing to feel free to speak their mind, this makes a lot of sense to me, but I'm wondering how you put it into dialogue with some of the tools you want to marshal against CRT and Marxist thought. This goes back to your question, right? Sort of, should the critical race theorists get free speech too, or do they go to—
Yeah, on college camp, the book Black Out for America was written for parents, teachers, students, and it's really focused on K through 12, because parents didn't know what hit them when their little first graders came home crying because some teacher told them that their ancestors were responsible for all the evil in the world. When they were shown pictures of the dogs during the civil rights movement attacking the marchers, and this was being shown to first and second graders. And so there were things that were happening in K through 12. And a lot of the parents that, you know, they've been accused of wanting to burn books and not wanting certain kind of books. I know many of the leaders of these organizations, and what they have really argued for is age appropriate materials. The things that you would give a middle school student or a high school student would be very different from what you want to give your first, second, and third grader. But they were really shaming and bullying young children because of the color of their race, color of their skin. And my position is that if it's unacceptable to do to Blacks and Hispanics and Asians, it's also unacceptable to do to whites. And so the Moms for Liberty, Moms for America, Mom, they're just probably hundreds of mom organizations out there. And it was the moms that fought back because their children were coming home. They were being traumatized. And what I've always encouraged those groups and also other people that are trying to change the culture is that it's not Democrats against Republicans. That most Americans, I believe that we share the same values. We want the same things for our children, and that it's people talking to one another. And I think that there's some changes that have happened that have not been good for our children. And there are too many people who are afraid to speak up. And I think we would have a better society if that were not the case. And when you talk about college campuses, I mean, what happened to academic freedom? Like what we find is that some people are allowed to make racist comments or do all kinds of things and get away with it if you belong to the right racial, ethnic, or religious group. But if someone else does it, they're going to be out of there. And the protests and the threats that have been lobbied against, well, I don't know the word I want to use, what the Jewish students have experienced, I guarantee you that if it were Black students and the protesters were whites, it would have been shut down within minutes. And the leaders that were threatening people, the students would have been suspended that were issuing those threats. And so we have to stop these double standards. And I think it's racist and it's demeaning when we don't do that. It's racist and it's demeaning that if you really believe that people are equal, they should be treated equally, then you need to hold them all to the same standard. And we don't see that happening on college campuses.
We have time for one more question. I see one more hand.
This is an oddball question, but how would academia improve if before you entered graduate school, every student had to prove that they worked for an entire full year doing manual labor, including construction trades, working at McDonald's or some other skill, because the academics I respect the most seem to have had some sort of that experience in their background.
Well, you know something, I have always felt that one reason we can't solve our public policies, we have too many people on the Supreme Court, in Congress, you know, in positions of power. They've never held a real job. I'm sorry. I'm going to say that just going to school and being the top of your class and, you know, doing a research project and getting, you know, it doesn't give you the knowledge that you're going to make public policies that are going to actually change things. And I think that if we had more people that had real life experiences, job experiences, everything not handed to them, that you would see more compassion, but you'd see better public policy outputs. And I can tell you, again, I go back to my years at Princeton, that there were a lot of people that went to work for government. And so they are responsible for making all these policy decisions. But these are people that they've never really held a job other than studying. And I can tell you that for myself, okay, I said I've worked in nursing homes, I worked in a garments factory, I've been a sales clerk, and had that terrible feeling that you have when you go to work and the sun is shining, when you get out, it's pitch dark, you know, and you got to go there and you got to do all that stuff. That those kinds of experiences, you know, like when you get to graduate school and you find out they pay you to study. They pay you to study. I mean, boy, I mean, that is the, who knew? I didn't know, but yeah, but for people that have never had to work, they don't realize how good they have it. And they can't always relate to, you know, the people that are in front of them. And so I think that, especially at state universities, because many of the students that you get would come from a range of backgrounds, more so than what I encountered at Princeton and Vanderbilt, that it would be important to have professors that could actually relate to where their students came from and to see the potential in those students and to understand, you know, what it takes for success. And what it takes for success is not some professor telling you that because of the color of your skin or your sex or your poverty, which you can't do.
But we are now out of time, so please join me in thanking our speaker.
Thank you.